The past is not just an even progression through the past 5 million years. The settlement of the Americas came from northeastern Asia around Bering Strait, that was dry land during the last glaciation. Those best species still feed us now. They've never, ever gone away. Sydney Harbour here was a gorge, a sandstone gorge 130 metres deep with a little tiny river.
We know a lot about early human societies, especially as they grew more complex and morphed into states, empires, and nations. But there's a lot we don't know, such as why did early humans, who had lived for 100,000 years or more as foragers, begin living in much bigger communities? But why? Why did humans change their behaviour? Why did they begin farming in different parts of the world around the same time? And why did these early societies share many common characteristics? Big questions, no easy answers. Dive into the mysteries of the universe with Unknowns. From the secrets of the Big Bang to the future of humanity. Discover what we still don't know. Tune in and explore the unknown. Hi, I'm Kim Lochner and I'll be your Unknowns guide. Our host is David Christian, a historian, the founder of Big History, and the host of the Unknowns podcast. Our guest today is Peter Bellwood, Professor Emeritus of Archaeology at the Australian National University. Peter's research focuses on early human migration and the origins of agriculture. He's written numerous books on the beginnings of agricultural societies, the peopling of the Pacific Islands, and the interconnections between archaeology, linguistics, and migration. First, we need to ask, why did early humans migrate thousands of miles from their ancestral home in Africa?
The past is not just an even progression through the past 5 million years of hominin evolution, separating from chimpanzees and bonobos in Africa. It has had jumps. Some of these jumps have involved massive movements. When humans first got into Asia out of Africa, it caused massive changes. When they first got into America, when they first got into Australia about 50,000 years ago, that had a massive impact on what followed. So the past is a continuous theme that goes on with jumps, but every now and again things happen that mean that large numbers of humans suddenly decide to move. The climate can change, or a land bridge can form in very deep history, or there can be a war. But basically, migration to me is the essential underlying factor is the increase in human population. That people are not going to migrate in a massive way unless they really want to inhabit more land.
Peter, we're looking at mysteries, and for me, one of the more mysterious things is how humans got to the Americas. Are we getting closer to solving that mystery?
Yes, very definitely, partly through ancient DNA. I mean, the first Americans came from northeastern Asia, including Japan, and they probably went up the coastline across Bering Strait and then down through Alaska and British Columbia into the Americas. But, of course, the route to the Americas during the last ice age, between the peak of the ice, say around about 20,000 years ago, was blocked by ice that extended out over the sea down the western coast of Canada. And it wasn't until that ice began to retreat that humans could get past, because they could get access to the land, and probably also, of course, they also had boats. We know that from the fact that they could reach offshore islands that were not land-bridged. I know that there are suggestions that they perhaps got there before the last glaciation, that is before 25,000 years ago. The suggestions come from very small amounts of data that tend to have mostly been disproven by further analysis. My view is that if humans arrived in the Americas before the end of the ice age, before the ice retreated, then it's unlikely that they would have died out, because there were so many naive animals that had not seen a human presence before. They would have been very easy to hunt. And in fact, we know from analyses of archaeological sites and skeletons that are younger than 16,000 years, when the climate was becoming warmer, we know from those analyses that the population at 16,000 years ago was growing very quickly because there was so much to hunt.
The human population.
The human
we're
population.
Talking about. Yeah.
And it took them less than 1,000 years to get from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. So for me, the settlement of the Americas came from northeastern Asia, around Bering Strait, that was dry land during the last glaciation, and then down through the Western Americas and beyond the ice into what is now the USA, and through the Isthmus of Panama, of course, that was a major bottleneck for them, into South America.
So what's the earliest date that you find plausible for humans?
It's about 15,500 years at the moment. Yeah. But it varies slightly, and it's from archaeological dating.
Now, let's get on to agriculture, which has been at the centre of your research, and which I think most people would agree is absolutely critical to understanding social complexity. Now, first, can I ask you, I think you prefer the term food production to that of agriculture. Could you explain why?
Well, because agriculture tends to sort of imply crops. It doesn't really cover things like pastoralism. But you see, pastoral peoples are also food producers because their animals are domestic.
You're talking about people like the Mongols?
Yes. Or the Bedouin, yes, of course, yes. So food production is a neutral term. So I tend to use that in my writings. Yes, it is becoming used more commonly. Food production means that the animals and plants concerned are managed by humans and they become domesticated. In other words, their genetic structures are changed through human selection because humans, of course, interfere in their breeding patterns. They plant them and breed them and so forth. And they become more and more productive, more amenable in their behavior. And they can also be transferred more freely to distant environments. That's how the Polynesians survived. They took domesticated plants and animals in their canoes. If they'd been trying to carry wild pigs throughout Polynesia, they wouldn't have done very well. But quiet little domesticated pigs and chickens and taro and yams are much more transportable than totally wild foods.
So you see domestication as central to all our ideas about agriculture.
Well, hunter-gatherers, of course, also migrate, but mainly the great migrations that have given rise to language families and complex societies have been caused by agricultural population migration. There's no doubt about that.
When do we get evidence of the first farming?
Well, one of the small problems here is how do you define domestication and farming? And they're gradual things. Domestication of, let's say, wheat, barley, cattle, and so forth probably took 2,000 or 3,000 years to get from a wild animal or plant to a totally domesticated one, like an ear of wheat that doesn't shatter when it's ripe, that grows at their standard height and can easily be threshed. Many complicated biological issues here about animals and plants, but domestication takes quite a long time. When did it start, and why, I suppose? The last ice age, it peaked between about 25 and 18,000 years ago. There were many
When you say peaked, you mean the coldest
the coldest point. It nadired, if you like, After 18,000 years ago, the climate began to warm, and the amount of food in the world, the amount of carbon dioxide, the amount of foliage, the animals that fed on that foliage increased. Humans increased their numbers. We can trace that. They increased them as hunter-gatherers, but eventually increasing numbers of hunter-gatherers begin to impact on the environment, and they start to want to manage their food supplies. Indigenous Australians managed their food supplies. When Europeans arrived, they were burning the landscape, sometimes transplanting. They did not have domesticated plants and animals, except for the dingo, which is in origin a domestic dog from Asia. But they were managing their environments. Round about 12,000 years ago, some groups began to produce what archaeologists recognize as incipiently domesticated wheat, barley, cattle, especially in the Middle East. In China, a similar thing happened, I suspect quite independently, in the Yellow River and also the Yangtze, around about 7,000 BCE. Similar things started happening in Mesoamerica, that is Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala. And similar things also in the central Andes, in Peru, and adjacent parts of western Amazonia, in southwestern Brazil and areas like that. These people were lucky. Jared Diamond pointed this out many years ago. Agriculture started in the places where there happened to be, for biogeographical reasons, very large numbers of amenable species that you could domesticate quite easily and that would behave themselves and respond to human pressure. And like large-grained annual cereals, animals that were not excessively aggressive and all that sort of thing.
Could you give us a quick list of what you regard as the best species to try to domesticate?
And don't forget, those best species still feed us now.
Yes.
They have done so. They've never, ever gone away. Once they got locked in, They've stayed, and they're here right now in all the supermarkets. Wheat, barley, rice, maize. Okay, they're four massive ones. Plus things like peas and lentils, legumes. Amongst the animals, well, cattle, sheep and goats and pigs come from the Fertile Crescent. Pigs also from China, but not cattle, sheep or goats. They came in from West Asia into China. Dogs are universal. Dogs were domesticated by hunter-gatherers long before farming. The Mexican civilizations, probably a lot of their hunting was deer, rabbits, things that they had to hunt. They probably trapped them. They don't appear to have domesticated them.
Yeah.
The American civilizations never really developed animal domestication outside the Andes.
Can I ask what I guess is the more complicated and mysterious one, which is why?
Yeah.
I mean, if humans have been around apparently quite happily, living in small groups without agriculture for hundreds of thousands of years, why?
Well, millions of years, if you go back into the hominins that preceded Homo sapiens. Well, of course, the last ice age before the penultimate one, if you like, the last but one was about 120,000 years ago. Neanderthals were living in much of Europe and Asia then, maybe early Homo sapiens in Africa. No, they didn't develop agriculture. We don't know why, they just didn't. Well, if they did, we have no record. There are no domestic animal bones, no signs of any villages.
And you're saying that's curious because there was a warm period.
Yes, there was a warm period like now.
20,000 years ago, similar to the one during which our species developed agriculture.
Yes, and nothing happened. And what people are thinking now is that between 50 and 70,000 years ago, especially in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that was clearly the last major homeland of Homo sapiens, something developed in I suppose the sentience or the thinking capacity of Homo sapiens to make it somehow smarter perhaps than other species. It may also have increased its birth rate. Females might have been able to have more children on the average than the other now extinct species.
Could language be part of it?
And language might have been, of course, language is very hard to find. The structure of our throat and our hyoid bone means that we can talk. And hyoid bones, that's the little loose bone in the throat that vibrates or something to make sound. The Neanderthals had hyoid bones, and even fossils that are 400,000 years old. So early hominins could speak, but whether they could, write Shakespeare is another matter, or is a different matter altogether. Modern humans, as we know, have this immense capacity to create spoken language and written language and everything that comes from it. As far as we know, the other hominins and people living 120,000 years ago didn't have those capacities.
So, at the risk of oversimplifying, are you saying that sudden climatic warming at the end of an ice age created the preconditions, but the humans were not yet ready to take those opportunities?
I would say that, definitely.
But 10,000 years
ago,
well,
make it 15,000 years ago. The preconditions were there. Now, the climate did not cause the agriculture, because if it had done so, there'd be agriculture everywhere. It was only agriculture in a small number of places. Some people were lucky. They hit it rich, where the animals and plants that they could domesticate were available. And the Middle East, China, Mexico, Peru, have those combinations of possibilities. And of course, if you think carefully about the history of human civilization, ancient civilizations, where did they all start? They started precisely in those places.
Yeah.
The Middle East, China, Central America, Mexico, and Peru, of course. And it's not coincidence. It is not coincidence, no.
Great. Now we've got some ideas about when and why. Now, can I ask how agriculture changed the way people lived? Because already, even the earliest agriculture is creating societies that, by many criteria, are much more complex than those of the earlier, of the preceding period.
There's a lot of anthropology about this, of course. I mean, when Europeans exploded out of Europe in the colonial era, they made lots of records about how people lived in America and Australia and so forth, and Africa. It's pretty clear that hunter-gatherers, if they're mobile, if they're moving around the countryside, their women tend to have rather few children because they have to carry the babies and they don't want dozens of babies being carried. Hunting and gathering does sort of lower the population size. Agriculture means that you live in one place because your crops grow in one place, and there's a huge pressure to be sedentary. In other words, to live in a village and stay in that village. Maybe move out now and again for specific purposes, but be basically sedentary. And if you're basically sedentary, and especially if you have agricultural foods that you can grind up and feed to babies, so farming takes the lid off the population.
even the earliest forms of farming lead to a sort
It
of
would be gradual.
population explosion.
Yeah, it would be gradual. Take place over a few thousand years.
Yeah.
But then by, let's say, 10,000 BC, 9,000 BCE, as we say nowadays, humans were in the Middle East were starting to become very numerous. And last year I was in Turkey at a conference in a city called Şanlıurfa, where there are huge stone monuments that were built about 9,000 BC with great big pillars and carvings on them. Monuments and villages and signs of very large numbers of people congregating in localized places, probably fed on partly domesticated crops and animals, having ceremonies and things like that. Not yet any Tutankhamons or great kings. That they do come later. That sort of level of empires.
But this is
kings.
the beginning of
This
social
is the
conquest.
beginning.
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, when you look at people like Polynesians, of course, they had very high chiefs who were seen as divine, and the local people were terrified of them. They had great power. They were not kings in the sense of European or Roman emperors, but their social structure was based on the order of birth, so that the people who got to the islands first would form high-ranking lineages, and then their male children would sort of be born in an order, and usually the eldest one would become the next chief, primogeniture. There were women who were quite important in Polynesia in the 18th century, but they weren't the highest chiefs. They often came to power because their husband died, and they were matriarchs, and matriarchs over younger men who were becoming chiefs.
So I should say the phrase social complexity itself needs a bit of unpacking, I guess.
It's very
because small foraging or hunting and gathering communities could be extraordinarily complex. But here we're talking about complexity that's related to larger size, to greater hierarchy, to new social roles and so on.
It's all about population size. Demography matters. Demography matters immensely. The human species is capable of reproducing at an incredibly rapid rate in certain circumstances. And we can see that in the recent past. It rapidly dies down as social conditions change. Humans are amazing in the large mammal world, the range of reproductive capacity that they have to fill the landscape when they want to.
What sort of evidence do we have? I mean, those dates you gave us.
Yes.
How do we know? We have no documents at all.
Yeah, no. When I was a student, the evidence mostly came from archaeology. Now we have immense levels of technology, genetics, and the recovery of ancient DNA from ancient bones. In certain circumstances, not all, often it doesn't survive, but when it does, it can be analysed.
What are the oldest bones that we've been able to analyse?
For ancient DNA, you mean? Yeah. About 430,000 years.
400? How amazing.
And they come from a deep shaft in northern Spain near the city of Burgos. They're early Neanderthals. No one's got DNA from before that yet. They might. So Homo erectus, Australopithecus, no, we don't have DNA.
Can you give us some feeling for how farming began to spread around the world?
Well,
because that's the key, the next stage of social complexity.
My view, and I've looked at a lot of ethnography about this, farming spread with the farmers, and the farmers were increasing their numbers.
It wasn't a matter of the neighbours borrowing the technology.
No, I have to say, and if you look at the case of North America or Australia, there were hunter-gatherer societies when Europeans arrived. Australians, and I'm talking here about Aboriginal, indigenous Australians, did not suddenly adopt agriculture as soon as Europeans arrived, even in places that Europeans didn't go to, like much of the Northern Territory and so forth. They were not interested. It wasn't part of their life. Agriculture is a difficult thing to do. You have to have the animals and plants. You have to know how to do it. You have to stabilize your life into sedentary villages. If you're a mobile hunter-gatherer with an attitude towards land that we can see in the Aboriginal community now, you're not particularly going to want to suddenly build a village, and it doesn't happen, and it didn't happen in California. A beautiful, absolutely fertile agricultural landscape now was full of hunter-gatherers when Europeans arrived, and they never adopted maize, even though they were in contact with maize growers in Arizona.
So agriculture required completely different traditions and customs and ideas about what's right and what's wrong.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes hunter-gatherer people will adopt farming. Sometimes they're forced to, of course, because modern nations make them settle down, full stop. and you get no choice. But basically, it's the farmers spreading. And as they spread, they're entering new environments where there's not a lot of competition from indigenous people. Through analyses of DNA, you can reconstruct how fast the population is growing from studying the number of mutations and how frequently they occur. And the bigger the population, the more mutations, put it that way. So all these sort of techniques, farmers increase their numbers. And what's interested me over the years is that they spread languages. And when we think of languages, English is one language in a huge family that goes all the way to now Bangladesh. Well, before the colonial era, the Indo-European language family was spread from Iceland to Bangladesh and into the Middle East, Iran. Languages can have a common root over such a vast area, which is way beyond the size of any known the Romans, Alexander the Great, they were nothing compared to the size of the Indo-European language family.
So the spread of agriculture can be tracked partly through the spread of languages.
Yes. And the crops and animals that were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent spread early on to the limits that were still the limits of the Indo-European and the Afro-Asiatic language family, which includes Egyptian in northern Africa. Millions of square kilometres. I mean, it is quite incredible. Language is an amazing tracker of human activity and human migration.
Peter, we've spent a lot of time talking about the preconditions for the second stage of social complexity. I'm talking about it as the second stage. And I mean really something that began to become apparent from about 5,000 years ago with cities, states, hierarchies, armies, writing, and so on. What was new about this phase?
What was new? Well, one thing was very new. Okay, let's look at Egypt and Mesopotamia. Now, Egypt and Mesopotamia, their high cultures formed in lowland valleys near the sea where there are deltas. Those lowland valleys and their deltas did not exist until early in the Holocene, when the sea level rose after the last ice age. Sydney Harbour here was a gorge, a sandstone gorge 130 metres deep, with a little tiny river flowing in the bottom of it. The seas filled it up. And the same thing happened in Mesopotamia and Egypt and in China, in the Yangtze, the lower Yangtze, Yellow Rivers. And the sea covered many coastlines, forming coral reefs and fertile coastlines. A lot of low-lying agricultural landscapes didn't really form until this sea level rise after the last ice age. The Sumerians and the Babylonians, if you like, in Mesopotamia, the Egyptians, they took advantage of this. It took them quite a while. They didn't really start taking advantage of it till about 6,000 BCE, because those low-lying landscapes were still filling with alluvium, and the sea was still retreating. Eventually, the sea stabilized because they were farmers. They were releasing soil from hillsides, and the Nile Delta built up, for instance. Therefore, you have the foundation of the city of Memphis and the building of the pyramids at Giza, right next to the Nile Delta. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians built large cities. They invented writing. Huge numbers of people congregated where there was huge production of wheat, barley, sheep, wool. Wool was a major product for the Sumerians. That's basically what I think happened. It's a combination of environmental change allowing these developments to occur. It's gradual. If you look at Mesopotamia, you start with initial villages of mud brick houses, let's say 6,000 BC, down near the head of the Persian Gulf. Then by 4,000 BC, much larger complexes, sometimes fortified, with temples are being formed. By 3,000 BC, you start to get the beginnings of what is called cuneiform writing with the Sumerian language and the Akkadian, that is a Semitic language. And these cities then, you find massive temples on platforms, ziggurats, if you like, or pyramids were for burial, of course, in Egypt. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia were temple bases, not for burial. Burials in Mesopotamia were put down shafts under the ground, like the famous ones of the royal burials of which date to about 2600 BC. And it goes on from there. But of course, as we know through history, different civilizations with different languages, they replace each other, partly through warfare, sometimes disease.
Peter, can I end by asking you, returning to the idea of mysteries, what big questions about the evolution of social complexity still really puzzle you? And do you think there are any mysteries that you have taken a part in solving?
Well, the one that I've taken a part in solving is the one of where Austronesians, including Polynesians, actually come from. I was quite deeply involved in establishing that over many years, yes, of research. Cut a long story short, they come from southern China, but they spent a period of about 1,000 years in Taiwan, and then they migrated through the Philippines and into the Pacific, across the north side of New Guinea into Melanesia and Polynesia. And by about 3,000 years ago, they reached the central Pacific, the islands of Tonga and Samoa. And 3,000 years ago, they were living with agriculture, domesticated pigs and dogs. They had yam and taro. They built villages. They made beautifully decorated pottery. But then the migration stopped, and it stopped for 2,000 years.
2,000 years?
And it wasn't until 1000 CE, AD, after Christ, that they reached the islands of the eastern Pacific, like New Zealand, Hawaii, Tahiti, and French Polynesia, the Cook Islands. And that's often been an interesting mystery. That is very clearly demonstrated from archaeology, dating of sites, and linguistics, the relationships of the languages. The Eastern Polynesian languages are much younger.
And New Zealand's a bit of an outlier
New Zealand
because
is
it's
Eastern,
a sort of Western,
yes, but New Zealand has a language. Maori is very close
Yeah.
to Tahitian, and Cook Island, Rarotongan. Why did they stop for 2,000 years? And one of the suggestions, which I think is probably correct, is that in the Central Pacific there are many atolls. Coral is a living creature, and when the sea level rose, the coral had to grow to keep up with it. And it didn't reach the surface to form the atolls until about 1,000 years ago. And once the coral reached the sea surface and made available land that people could stop at and start to build soil and inhabit, that allowed the secondary migration 2,000 years later to occur, because the distances were very, very great. There's several thousand kilometers. That is one possibility, but that is a mystery. Yeah, why were Tahiti and Hawaii and New Zealand settled 2,000 years later than Tonga and Samoa in the Central Pacific? And it may be because of the availability of land, because of the growth of coral in the Central Pacific. As for mysteries, well, when it comes to civilizations, I think we can see how they grow through the rise of cities and the archaeological traces of those cities. They just get bigger, and the temples get bigger. But what the great mystery is not so much how they were founded, but it's what happened to them when they died. And of course, we do have great mysteries over the Roman Empire, but especially you have a culture like the famous civilization in Pakistan. It's called the Indus Valley Civilization. Yeah. That is thought by many people to have been totally extinct, and the one in Crete, the Minoans. Yeah. They're thought to have been totally extinct civilizations that did not speak known languages and that have vanished. I don't agree entirely. I think, like the late Roman Empire, they just shifted. And I think that the Indus Valley people were ancestral to northern Indians, as they are today. They spoke Indo-European languages. In the case of Crete, those Minoans, I'm sure, spoke a language related to the language that the Mycenaeans were speaking in Greece at the same time. I can't prove it, but to me it's pretty obvious.
So this is a reminder that the rise of complexity is not a continuous process. There are rises and falls. And what you're saying, I take it, is that the falls remain mysterious.
You see, the Maya are another fall, because they abandoned their ceremonial centers. They didn't die. There are millions of Maya-speaking people in Mexico and Guatemala, millions, but they shifted. Something happened in the organization that broke down, and ordinary people, had to move away and abandon. They didn't all die. We don't find skeletons everywhere, but they moved.
So
probably went back to peasantry again.
So as societies got more and more complex, I guess just holding them together got more and more difficult.
It becomes more and more difficult.
And then eventually a breakdown.
Something breaks down.
And that is a terrible warning for us today, isn't it?
And you see, with the people who lived in the Indus Valley, they abandoned their cities in the Indus Valley itself, but they didn't vanish. They moved into northern India. They moved into the region around Delhi, in the upper Yamuna and Ganges valleys, and founded much smaller settlements, more like peasant villages, I suppose.
So this is one more example of something you've talked about a lot, which is environmental change that created both problems and opportunities that modern humans were able to take advantage of or to solve.
Yeah, and environmental change, of course, is immense. With the cycles of glaciation, the rise and fall of sea level, 130 meters up and down, over tens of thousands of years, the thing is about glaciations, they form gradually, but at the end of them, you come out very rapidly.
Right.
And exactly why that is, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's all to do with Milankovitch cycles and, the sun's rotation, the Earth's rotation around the sun and its orbit as it wobbles and things like that, complicated things. But certainly coming out of that is why people got to the Americas 16,000 years ago. It was this rapid warming after the last ice age that allowed them to travel down the coast of Canada and Alaska and enter the Americas. So yes, of course, climate change in that sense is of major importance when it opens doorways like that, physical doorways.
Peter, I can't resist. You've given me an opportunity for a great plug for Big History.
Yeah.
Which is that Big History forces people looking at history to think about the impact of astronomy, geology,
everything.
of climate change, of other creatures on human history. And it means that human history ceases to be purely a matter of how damn clever we humans are.
Yes, of course it is.
And becomes a matter of us humans fitting in with a complex and constantly changing world.
Yeah, you've only got to look at what affects us as humans today, everything from climate change to COVID to, the things that we have no control over. Well, we think we have no control over. I suppose we do eventually, but yes, of course, it is those factors are very important.
Peter, thank you very much. I think you're leaving us with a sense that first that the rise of complexity was not, well, there were powerful drivers, but those drivers could break down. And it's the breakdowns that maybe at the moment
could break down now.
Most mysterious.
Peter, you've left us with a lot to think about. Most people think of the rise of complexity as constant, taking us from point A to point B. But sometimes that progress can break down and lead to the transformation of societies. It's not necessarily that these once great civilizations fell, but rather that they transformed into something different. Yet it's those drivers of change and why these changes happened that might be the most mysterious. Our next and last episode expands on the technological achievements humans have made and delves into the mysteries of the future of technology. Check out the other episodes of Unknowns, where we explore mysteries and questions about our origins and our future. Interested in learning more about Big History? Check out the Big History Project, a free online course for middle school and junior high students.